Brandt DXT grain carts have efficient unload speeds, large carrying capacities, unmatched durability, and reliable components that make sure your cart is working when you are. Lead the field with DXT grain carts from Brandt. Visit your local Brandt dealer for more information.
You're listening to Ruminating with RealAg, the podcast that chews on the latest in beef production, with your host, Amber Bell.
I'm Amber Bell, and this is Ruminating with RealAg. For today's episode, I am very excited to have Dr. Kris Nichols with me. Kris runs KRIS Systems and has been studying soil biology for a long time, with one of her favorites being mycorrhizal fungi. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about the importance of the very complex system that's beneath our feet, how farmers and ranchers can better that system using small changes, and just a generalized look at what soil biology is doing and what has changed and what hasn't changed. Hi, Dr. Nichols. It's so great to see you again.
It's great to see you too, Amber.
Okay, so I am really excited about this conversation. It has been a while since we've seen each other. And thankfully soil, mycorrhizal fungi, the things in the soil, they don't change quickly enough that would have changed in that length of time. So let's start with that big picture. What actually is going on beneath our feet that most of us miss out on when we think about soil?
Well, I think that the big thing within soil is, as you said, first off, that soil is universal and it's constantly, things are constantly happening and there's constant movement and activity with the microbial community. The mycorrhizal fungi, the bacteria, other fungi, protozoa, all of these organisms that are below ground are continuously functioning and really trying to maintain the overall big picture function of what's happening in the soil, to be able to help to cycle and manage water and nutrients, to provide those to the plants, create good structure that's going to allow for good water movement into the soil and out of the soil, as well as good gas exchange, CO2 being able to escape from the soil and oxygen to get into the soil and feed the soil biology. And so it really is, all these multiple layers of function that I think of sort of as a very complex physical biogeochemical environment where you have all of these organisms working together. And the big thing for me that keeps on changing and that I keep getting excited about is on many levels learning that I just don't know enough. And that's the big thing that keeps changing. I mean, we talked about maybe there's hundreds of thousands of fungi in the soil now, or millions and, millions to possibly billions of bacteria, different species that are in the soil. I mean, the numbers just keep going up on the complexity and on the complexities of the relationships. And so I think of it as, sort of it's constantly a new frontier. And there's constant excitement to be able to do that. And constant excitement, I think, for many people to get excited about it, not just farmers and ranchers, but consumers, but also young people who are maybe starting different careers out there to be able to utilize new technology, new ideas, new ways of really making these connections. A lot of the things we're excited about with connecting our understanding of the soil microbiome to the gut microbiome and to our food. And as we talk more and more and learn more and more about how the gut microbiome sort of controls us as human beings, we're really learning how it almost on many levels, from my perspective, is the soil microbiome controls the plants, and the plants then are fed to animals, and the gut microbiome in the animals controls the animals, but it all starts with the soil microbiome. And that's the foundation that really just excites me all the time.
It's so crazy to think about cycles like that. Like, I love patterns, and I've heard it explained many times that, like, what happens with a plant above ground is also happening below ground. And it's crazy to think, like, that's very small scale. If you think like large scale, there's so many analogies that can be made in the way that we operate and what's actually happening beneath our feet.
Yeah, yeah. And that's, th those patterns. It's sort of like I keep saying it's so complex, but on many levels, it's the same patterns, the same large scale patterns. The organisms involved in them, the details are different, the chemical reactions differ, but the overall sort of function of how it all works. And it really is sort of this carbon economy that's happening in the exchange of carbon. And I've really come to kind of think of things where, we talk a lot about nitrogen cycles and phosphorus cycles and different nutrients and water cycles. But if you look at all of those cycles, carbon is a major part of that. And so for me, it's like carbon is the one ring that controls them all.
Mm,
And we really need to be thinking about that, the one ring that is controlling all of these functions. And so how is it that we can be managing carbon flows? Above ground to below ground and back and forth and all of those exchanges. And then, as I said, how that transcends into, the microbes that are in our bodies and in the bodies of other animals.
right, for sure. Yeah, I could go off on so many tangents there, but I think we'll start with some basics. So you've spent years studying soil biology. Now, how did you first become fascinated by what we can't see and a lot of people don't even consider in what's in the soil?
Well, I grew up on a farm in southwestern Minnesota, and when I first went off to university, like a lot of farm kids, it was like I didn't want anything to do with agriculture, and I didn't want anything to do with farming. Um, but I, at the University of Minnesota, took a class in plant biology, and at the time, and this makes me sound so old, but it's true, I'm old. But at the time, fungi, even though they had their own kingdom, they were still in a lot of the basic courses, were still grouped with plant biology. So I took a plant biology course that was also talking about fungi. And the professor that was teaching that course, I loved her perspective and the way that she was thinking and how she did things. And her research lab was on mycorrhizal fungi, um, in particular, muscular mycorrhizal fungi. And the mycorrhizal fungi are this symbiosis between plants and the fungi in the soil. And the fungi will grow into their roots. And I think of it sometimes like uh, the best, most efficient Amazon that Jeff Bezos can't even dream that he could build. Um, because what we're doing is you have the plants that essentially call up their order any time of the day, and they'll order copper today or copper right now, and 2 seconds from now they'll order zinc. It's all happening almost instantaneously. But with the mycorrhizal fungi, where it's similar to Amazon, is those nutrients are delivered right to the cell membrane, right inside the cell wall. So it's like delivery to your front door. And you can order up anything you want and it's going to be delivered to your front door. And again, it's almost instantaneous. It's like I said, Jeff Bezos has nothing on the level of efficiency that the soil microbiome and the mycorrhizal fungi have in being able to provide that. So that just I was sort of really fascinated with that because growing
Mm,
up on a farm, we talked a lot about nutrients and how we were managing with the rotation and how we were trying to improve fertility, and to realize that in all actuality so much more of this could happen through the soil microbiome. And
right.
we weren't even really talking about the soil microbiome at the time. um, so again, I'm old. We were talking about the soil microbiome back in caveman days. Um, and so the whole idea was just fascinating to me. Um, and so my first projects actually weren't on agricultural land. We were doing a lot of wetland reclamation work in the state of Minnesota, which is basically, it said it's the land of 10,000 lakes. There's more like 15,000, but we're always constantly trying to improve hydrology in the water cycle in the state of Minnesota, as many states are becoming more concerned about the water cycle. Um, but I started off with that. And then as I went through graduate school, I wanted to do graduate work in mycorrhizal fungi. I uh, applied and was accepted at the university where the International Culture Collection of Vesicular or Muscular Mycorrhizal Fungi in VAM was housed. So it was sort of the leader of mycorrhizal fungi. And what was really interesting was at the time, Dr. Joseph Morton, who was leading that laboratory, was excited about trying to understand the evolution of mycorrhizal fungi.
Cool.
And he was also working with the research scientist, Dr. Sarah Wright, with the USDA Agriculture Research Service in Beltsville, Maryland, who was looking at a substance that she was beginning to identify called glomalin. And um, those two things, as I went to study with Dr. Morton, started to just sort of slam into each other in a way because uh, Dr. Wright was seeing so much glomalin being produced by the mycorrhizal fungi, and that it wasn't just sticking to the fungal hyphae. It was also sticking to soil aggregates and soil particles. And so, from an evolutionary standpoint, in talking with Dr. Morton, it was like, why would a fungus put so much energy into making something that is exuded from their surface that's sloughed off of the fungal hyphae and goes out there into the soil?
Hmm.
What is the benefit of that? And so really it started. I think I always was a kid who always asked the questions of why, and I always wanted to know why things happened. And this was really this big why evolution for me, in wanting to understand why you would have, not just why you would have mycorrhizal fungi to begin with, but then why you would make something like glomalin. And as I was starting to try and answer those questions, um, finishing up graduate school and then getting a job with USDA, with some farmers and ranchers that were starting to look at different, more innovative practices and tools involved in regenerative agriculture. It just helped to push me into more of this why does this work? Why is this going on? And I have to understand that why. And so the why questions, I think, are a big part of what's gotten me here, and why I continue to be excited about it, and why I love the fact that it continues to be more complex and more diverse, but more simple all at the same time.
Right, right, for sure. And so let's kind of go to where we're at in agriculture. And I think I feel like the conversation is a lot bigger than just agriculture right now. But soil health is a hot topic. I haven't looked it up recently, but I know on Google Trends it was showing to be one of, it's a top searched term. So what are we actually talking about when it comes to biology and soil health? And can you paint a picture of what a functioning soil ecosystem might look like?
So, in a functioning soil ecosystem, and again, this is kind of from an evolutionary standpoint, when we first had land on planet Earth, land wasn't soil. Soil is it is a new development on planet Earth. You don't have soil. And if you look, I mean, even as we're going to Mars, we're not taking samples of soil. We're taking samples of the mineral structure that's there, the sand, silts, and clay, because there isn't the organic matter, there isn't the carbon. And so there's a little bit of carbon on Mars that we're finding here and there, but for the most part, that carbon's been lost over time. And here on planet Earth, that carbon is essential to the creation of soil. So soil itself is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen bound to sand, silt, and clay. You don't have soil without having living organisms creating plants, and bacteria doing photosynthesis and transforming CO2 in the atmosphere into carbon compounds, and those becoming a part of the structure of the organisms themselves, as well as the biomolecules. So every cell, every molecule in our bodies, in almost all life on planet Earth, except for diatoms. Diatoms, their structure is made of silica rather than carbon, but they still do carbon chemistry. They still have carbon molecules inside them. They do the carbon biochemistry, the respiration. So, when we take in oxygen and breathe out CO2, the plants will take in CO2 and release oxygen, but they also take in oxygen and release CO2. They release that through their roots because that's a respiration process. It's a process of being able to metabolize and get energy from carbon. So photosynthesis, they take the energy of the sun and they put that energy between the carbon bonds that are in the simple sugars they make. And then through respiration, we release that energy by breaking up those bonds and reforming other molecules. And so what we're really trying to do is do that, as I said, do it the most efficient way and do it with the least amount of cost to the whole entire process. And that's what has happened, is that the microorganisms in soil biology, and the reason we're interested in soil health, is in agriculture, we've always been trying to identify the tools, or the mechanical tools or the chemical tools that could replace what biology does.
Right.
Um, the big one in nitrogen is we've got a synthetic process that was developed in the early 1900s, the Haber-Bosch process, and that's still the major part of how we make nitrogen fertilizer, and utilizing urea is that same chemical process. But the biggest issue with that process is that costs so much energy to do.
Right.
Um, and so the microorganisms designed a way to be able to do that. It still takes energy to do it, but they can do it so much more efficiently that it doesn't have that same level of costs. And again, like I said, delivering those orders to the door, and it's not just the orders of the nutrients to that cell membrane, to that front door for the plant cells, but it also is helping to deliver water. And when you're doing that, and you're doing that inside the plant cells, um, inside the cell wall, you don't have a lot of waste. So that's a big part of efficiencies. The systems we've designed are very inefficient. There's a lot of waste that happens. And it's difficult for us to design the most efficient things because that waste is sort of inherent in all of the processes that go along. Each level of the process has a certain amount of waste, and we can't make anything more efficient than what the microbes do. So, we're trying to utilize these very efficient processes. And the great thing about what the microbes are doing is they're not just delivering some of the macronutrients that we often get from our fertilizer applications, but they're also delivering the micronutrients. And
Right.
that is something where, from a plant, excuse me, from a plant perspective, um, micronutrients are present in concentrations that can be insufficient and toxic. And the line between that is very, very small. And so if we were wanting to, again, us add those micronutrients, we can't always add them in the right concentrations so that they don't fall on one side of that line or the other. We want, what the plant needs. If the microbes are delivering it, because it is that on-demand delivery, it allows for it to be done in a way that is, when the plant needs it, most efficient, in the form the plants need to have it. Everything is happening at that highest level of efficiency. And I know I keep saying the word efficiency, but that's where the cost variable comes in.
Right.
So the microbes designed a system that was so efficient as soil evolved. So they were part of helping to make soil in the beginning. And as soil was created and soil evolved, they ended up increasing those levels of efficiencies in how they were managing nutrients and water to the plants, because they were dependent on essentially getting the carbon, getting paid. Everybody works for food.
Right.
Whether we believe it or not, we all work for food. That's the primary thing that every organism is working for. And food is in the form of carbon. Um, and that's what those microbes are getting from the plant directly or indirectly. And so we want to make sure that that cycle is happening, and we're working with that. And what we've done over time, because we've disrupted that carbon cycle, that one cycle that controls them all, we've disrupted the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the sulfur cycles, the water cycles, all of these things that we've disrupted, things that are predator and prey relationships that help to manage pest and disease issues. We've disrupted the way that the plant cells actually function, because if the plant cells are functioning well and they're making a lot of the biomolecules that we need to get in our food, that our gut microbiome needs, the antioxidants, the polyphenolics, the precursors to various types of compounds, vitamins, all of the things that we need from our food, all of that stuff is made, or again, precursors partially made in the plant cells.
Hmm.
And so that then the gut microbiome can finish the process. And if it's not completed in the plant cells, it's completed in our guts, so that we get what we need into our bloodstream. But the issue is that when we're not allowing for that to happen, the plants aren't going to be making a lot of those biomolecules. And when they don't make those biomolecules, the plants are more susceptible to pests and diseases, because making those biomolecules, you start to fill the plant cells with biomolecules. And so the plant's cells need to have more fluid in the cell. And so the cell then expands. And as the cell expands, it puts pressure against the cell wall. And that can help to prevent um, insect pests from their proboscis and their teeth to bite through, and the proboscis to penetrate through into the plant cell wall and into the plant cell membrane and cause damage. Um, so it everything, again, it's like all of these layers end up working together in such a complex way, where we can have healthier plant cells, and then the healthier plant cells contain the things that prevent pest and disease organisms from being able to penetrate those cell walls and keep them healthy. But then they also have the things that our gut microbiome, or the rumen microbiome in other animals, that microbiome needs to be able to survive and thrive. And then that microbiome is basically now able to keep us healthier and send the right signals to our brains. Um, in the Western world, what we've learned is that there are more nerve cells around our gut system than there are in our brains. So
Wow.
our gut is really controlling our behavior. Our gut microbiome controls our behavior.
Huh.
And so, yeah, so the gut microbiome in the Western world right now, because we've reduced the nutritive quality of our food, the gut microbiome is essentially starving. And so the gut microbiome sends out a signal to our brains that says, feed me, feed me. And so we eat more.
Hmm.
And no matter what it is that we're trying to do, as far as, going on diets or those types of things, the gut microbiome is starving, and it's constantly saying, feed me, to our brains. And even if we don't feed it, what our brain response is to the rest of the cells in our body, if we're not going to consume food, the brain response to the rest of our cells in our body is to make more fat cells, because then they have the reserve storage
To pull
of
from.
at least carbon to pull from, exactly, to feed the gut microbiome. So it becomes this vicious cycle where, again, in the Western world, in first world countries, however you want to phrase it, we're suffering of the twin disorders of malnutrition and obesity. And we're obese because we're malnourished. And our gut microbiome is saying, feed me, whether we're choosing to feed it or not directly. If we go on a diet and don't feed it, our bodies are still not functioning in the way that they should because our gut microbiome isn't functioning in the way that it should. And so we really need to do this and address these cycles that are happening above and below.
And realistically, we see that within our soil health and soil life as well, right? Like as we
Yes,
go and we're like, hey, we're going to add fertilizer or add this or spray with pesticides or do something of that nature. At the same time, that is giving the plants, like our microbiome does in our gut, the chance to be like, hey, I don't need to make this. I don't need to make this extra effort. So I'm just going to use this, but it doesn't have everything that I need. It has just the main ingredient.
exactly, exactly. What we've done, I try to use analogies to sort of describe things that are happening in this world that we can't really see. Um, because I think that, again, the processes are very similar across all of these different scales, from macroscopic to microscopic. And what we've done to our soil microbiome is we've essentially outsourced the jobs of many of the microbes by adding some of these fertilizers or adding some of these pesticides to it. And again, as you were saying, what happens is then the plants don't feed the microbes.
Hmm.
So it basically, it really is like looking at what happens in a society or in a town when the jobs are outsourced from the main factory. You've basically shut that factory down and outsourced the jobs. So you shut down the nitrogen fixation process and the nitrogen transport process in the soil. And what ends up happening is it isn't like everybody in the town dies at once,
Hmm.
but the town starts to population starts to decline, people start to leave, you try and identify new jobs, you try and figure out what you can do, but eventually if you can't change what is needed, if you can't adapt to a new function, you end up dying. And
Hmm.
so what we've done is as I said, we think that there's millions to billions of different species of bacteria and, not hundreds of thousands, but now millions of different types of fungi and, all of this great diversity that's there. But what we're finding is not that a lot of our agricultural soils we've added a lot of inputs to and done a lot of soil disturbance to aren't completely devoid of soil organisms, but they don't have the diverse level of soil organisms to help to support the full function of the soil. Um, One of the organisms that's always going to stay are organisms that basically, I hate to say it this way, but they eat the trash. They're
Hmm.
they're the garbage microorganisms, and it is an important function that we need to have. We have garbage microorganisms all around us all the time. If you think about it, if we didn't have that, and you think about the amount of waste that you generate in a day, the amount of skin cells and hair and all of the things that slough off of us on a daily basis, if that didn't get broken down by microorganisms and it just was allowed to accumulate, we would be buried in our own trash
That is so
in less than a
crazy.
week. It is. It's like it's crazy and it's gross, but at the same time, it's just sort of wow,
Hmm.
how much of this is really needed. And so those trash microorganisms are going to be the primary organisms that are going to be there because their function is almost very simple in many levels. We eat and we give off CO2. We eat, we give off CO2. A colleague of mine, Don Rakowski, he used to work with the ARS, Agriculture Research Service, down in Morris, Minnesota, and he referred to them as piranha microorganisms, and they really are piranhas. their job is just to eat as fast and as much as they possibly can. So we aren't buried in trash. So
Right.
those organisms are going to be present. But again, from a functional standpoint, do you just want the trash eaters to be the only ones there?
They're the
Um,
magpies of soil biology.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a it's they serve a good function. We don't want them to be gone, but we don't want them to be the only ones.
Right.
And so that's what we've done in the way that we have basically broken that one ring of the carbon cycle and how carbon is flowing to essentially pay the microorganisms that are involved in acting like Amazon. And
Hmm.
so,
And so
to use
what
the
are
analogy to Jeff, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's okay.
Uh,
What are some of like the management decisions that farmers and ranchers can use? So let's talk like tillage, crop rotation, cover crops, What are some of the decisions that farmers and ranchers can use to increase or the diversity within their soil life?
Well, again going back to this, I think the biggest thing is helping to enhance this carbon cycling. And so the first thing that you can do is trying to increase carbon flow below ground.
Hmm.
And you do that by having more plants for more days of the year. That's the big key, is more days of the year, plants doing photosynthesis. And in North America in particular, in the US and Canada, and many of the places that we use for growing crops, we think of our growing season, we're always complaining about our growing season is too short. And, we think of our growing season as being somewhere between, roughly in some cases 60 to 130, maybe 140 days. It's a big spectrum across, that band of the prairies in the US and Canada in particular, but it's typically never more than 140. And, typically for most of it, it's never less than about 60.
Hmm.
So across that band. But what we've done is, because we've said that, that becomes the perspective on, that's the only thing that works. That's the only time in which I can have a plant growing. It's the only way in which, if I'm in an area in northern Alberta, Saskatchewan, um, Manitoba up into the territories, if I'm in that area, I can't do better than this. I can't do better than 60. Or, at most I could maybe push 80 or 90, but I can't do better than that.
Hmm.
And you go, even to in the United States down to the southern plains, and I can't do more than 140. There's 365 days of the year.
Right.
Across most of that landscape that we're talking about, the sun shines every single one of those days. Maybe
Hmm.
not for 12 hours every single one of those days, but it shines. And that is what is required to help to do photosynthesis. So why do we tell ourselves that we can't do more than what we say we can do for just the plants that we're utilizing to grow food?
Hmm.
Because we could be growing some other things that can help to put carbon below ground, as well as growing other things for food that would grow more in these other areas. Our major crops are crops that aren't necessarily designed. Many of them come from uh, more tropical zones.
Hmm.
That's where most of our crop plants originated is in tropical zones, from corn, soybeans to even wheat and oats. Most of that originated in the tropical zones. Yes, we've done breeding and selection and helped them to move into more northern climates, but we're missing a lot of options and opportunities that we could have to be growing something different and growing more, and utilizing those plants for forages for animals. Um, and a big part of our food cycle for that. So for me, the first things that I look at in my why part of this is, why do we not have enough soil? Why do we not have enough carbon below ground?
Hmm.
And when I think about why that is, what is it that I could get to get more carbon below ground? So getting more days of the year, increasing photosynthetic rates in our plants, looking at trying to improve that. And then the why did we outsource the job so we don't have the microbial diversity? When do we need to add? Why am I adding that fertility? And why am I adding that fertility at a time when the plant doesn't necessarily need it or can't absorb it? And that's the big part of, I think, where we could go with agriculture in the future is looking at how we could adapt and modify some of our tools so that we are adding. And we've already done a lot of this, but so we could add fertility if we needed to add fertility, we could add it when the plant has its demand.
Right.
Not so early on. And again, from an analogy standpoint, oftentimes I'll say this is basically you're going to have a child, you calculated how much food you needed to raise that child for 18 years. You bought all of that food before the child was even born, or sometimes right after it was born, and you put all of that food into the nursery and come back 18 years later and expect that child to be a productive member of society. It's not going to happen. And I know that sounds really ridiculous, because it's 18 years, but the life of the plant, that whole thing that we're looking at is a similar type of thing. So why are we not working with giving the plants what they need when they need it and enhancing the efficiencies and reducing our costs as farmers and ranchers to be able to get those resources?
I've been
So I think
speaking Sorry, I've been speaking to a farmer down south. I just did an interview with him in southern Saskatchewan, and he's been working on deep banding fertilizer. He's deep banding it at 10 inches. I think he said he has something like 18 to 20 different nutrients, micronutrients that are
mhm.
in that. And I can see, like, listening to you, that there's a reason that works, right? When those roots are nice and deep and big, that's when they get access to those nutrients. So would you say that that would maybe be helping the soil life, or does like how would that work?
Well, I think that that would help with the soil life to be putting it down that far. Definitely it you do have to have the soil life in order for that to work because when you
Hmm.
are deep banding, a lot of those nutrients are going to be bound into molecular compounds that aren't going to be readily available to the plant. They're going to bind, um, create organomineral complexes where they bind to clay minerals and make these complex structures that are much more difficult for those nutrients to get released um, to the plants. But that being said, so you need to have the microbial community to help to process and make those nutrients. You need the factory workers. If you just put, again, if you just put all of the steel that you needed to make a can of peaches and you just put the steel in there, but you didn't have any equipment to process the steel and make it into the can form and do all of those types of things, you have steel and you have a bunch of peaches that are rotting and nothing works in the way that. So you need to be able to have that kind of a thing where you have the microbial community that can process that. The other benefit of doing it like that is the biggest advantage the microbes can have is if they're actually growing with the plants, in some cases helping the seeds to germinate. Some seeds don't even germinate without the microbial community effects. You need some seeds that seed coat needs to get broken down by the microbial community before those seeds will even germinate. So you need the microbes to be there with those seeds and with that seedling. And as that plant is first starting to grow, before it's starting to do photosynthesis and feeding the soil microbiome, the microbiome needs to be active with that plant.
Right.
And when we provide, again, like outsourcing the job, if we provide the nutrients that that seed needs to be able to germinate and grow, those microbes aren't going to be active there because the microbe's job is to essentially, at that point in time, to utilize some of the carbon resources that are in the seed itself. They're using that carbon some of that carbon for their growth so that they can then provide, that's the money that's paid to them, that carbon, so that then they can, in the carbon economy, get the nutrients to help that seedling to be able to grow.
Right.
But if we don't do that, two things are going to happen. If we're adding the fertility, those microbes aren't going to be needed. So the seed, as it's being broken down, is just going to be processed by the trash microbes
Mm.
and not utilized by the rest of the microbial community that could then get the nutrients and get things started. So the earlier on that we can get these relationships, that's the best benefits that you're going to get from that. You're going to get the best benefits from fertility standpoint and also from a pest and disease management standpoint.
And what would you be your opinion on what the current state of, and I know it's hard because there's different ideas in farming but what would you say is the current state of our soil health and what would be like the maximum? Like what's that range? Where do we have to go?
Well, we have a long ways to go. We have in North America, we have some of the best soil on the planet. Um, but if we want to regenerate that soil back to where it was, we're still roughly, and again, it depends on the metric that you use, but if you're utilizing carbon as a metric, because that really is what soil is, uh, we're we had about a we still have about a 70 to 80% loss that we have to make up for.
Wow.
And when you think about it, when we're talking about things like percent organic matter in some of our soils, in much of the Canadian prairies, the soils would have had percent organic matter levels that were probably in uh, at least 10%, in some cases into the low teens. Um, in much of the northern plains of the United States, we're looking at numbers that were probably, again, in the mid to high teens. Uh, Further, as you go further south into the southern plains that are drier and a little bit hotter, that's going to mimic a little bit more like what's in Canada. So, in uh, at least 10%, but probably somewhere in the low teens.
Hmm.
And, across much of that landscape, we're lucky if we can make three in many places. Some really good operations are, around five. Some of the prairie potholes where we haven't in Canada and the United States, where we haven't uh, tilled up those prairie potholes. Some of those prairie potholes are, in there um, around 10, in some cases up to the low teens in percent organic matter. So uh, those are the things where, again, we've got a long way to go.
Hmm.
Um, and it took hundreds of thousands, at least, years to create the prairies that we have now, that we had then, sorry, that we had before we started
Started
major
farming.
agriculture. Yeah,
Hmm.
before we started major agriculture farming on those major cultivation on those landscape. And so we really need to, we've got a lot of work to do. But again, we have a lot of options and opportunities to be able to improve that. And I encourage farmers, sometimes researchers will say, well, you have this maximum that you're gonna get to. And I'm like, when farmers come and ask, what's the maximum? And I'm like, don't even worry about that. That should not even be on your radar. If you get to 20%, you can come and talk to me. But, other than that, that should not be on your radar as far as what the maximum is that we could be looking at. And so um, what we really want to do is, as you said, how can we get more carbon below ground? How can we really regenerate soil? And that's what I look at from regenerative agriculture it is it does a lot of things in regenerating societies and regenerating crops and regenerating food and making us have healthier and more nutrient dense food and animals, healthier animals. But the base foundation of it is what we're trying to do is regenerate soil. And so we
Right.
need to get carbon below ground. That means, having more carbon go to below ground more days of the year. Um, Having that carbon come in a lot of different forms to feed that soil microbiome, so that diverse microbiome. So, adding diversity to that system. Stop outsourcing the jobs, especially early on in the growing season. So again, that banding of the deep fertilizer, one of the things it does is, as we said, it doesn't outsource the job at the beginning of the growing season. So the
Hmm.
microbial community gets established, and then as the plant roots start to tap into some of that deep banded fertilizer, that is sort of, it helps the plant when the plant needs it most, but it doesn't totally outsource the job of the microbial community. The microbial
Right.
community is still working and processing and breaking down those deep banded fertilizers. Reducing some of the soil disturbance that we're doing. It doesn't mean that we have to be completely no-till all the time. Soil is used to being disturbed, and that was a big part of how the prairies evolved and how organic matter builds. Having disturbance by hoof traffic or mechanical traffic, we just want to make sure that that is measured level of disturbance, even
Right.
disturbance that can come from tillage or other types of mechanical disturbance. We want to think about why we're doing that and what are the ramifications of what we're doing on carbon flows.
Hmm.
So, how does that disturb things? So again, kind of like I said, getting the microbial community early on with that germinating seed. If we do a lot of tillage and some big inversion tillage, we can move the microbial community that was there at the end of last season, invert it. So now when the seed is germinating, that microbial community is 6 to 12 inches away from the seed.
Right.
It needs that carbon that's in that seed to help to get it active. Well, the plant starts to germinate. It gives off carbon compounds from the seed saying, come microbes, come, feed me, feed me, feed me. But there's only a small amount. And so that trickles out. Well, it's not going to trickle down 6 to 12 inches. You're not going to
Hmm.
get that 15 to 30 centimeters down into the soil. It's not going to happen.
Right.
So how is it that, we can think about when we're doing tillage, what is it that we're doing? Where are we putting the microbes um, from that newly germinating seed? We want to help to stimulate greater levels of photosynthetic rates. And some of that comes from, a big part of that comes from giving the plants a little bit of stress. And that
Hmm.
stress comes from either them having to give off some carbon to pay for nutrients from the microbial community and pay for water uh, from the soil environment and the soil structure and helping to form that structure. So, that's a stress to the plant, but we don't want to overstress the plant to injury. We want to make sure that it's a measured amount of stress and it's the stress coming at the right times, not when the plant is starting to flower and make grain. We don't want it to be under the highest level of stress at that point in time. Stress a little bit early on so we can get the plant working and doing more photosynthesis as it's growing in the vegetative phases. Utilizing animals as a tool to add a little bit of stress. Grazing is a stress, it's an injury to the plant. So when we talk about, having to integrate animals to the system, yes, it's important to have animals as a part of the system. Do they all need to always be the only animals that count are grazers? No, other animals can count as well because we want to see how that's going to have stress on the plant. You
Hmm.
have butterflies and pollinators and birds and bats and small mammals and other wildlife that are all going to add a little bit of stress to the plant.
Right.
All of those things can help to stimulate those activities. So, when we are in cases where we, for some reason, don't have a lot of large grazing animals, what are other things that we could bring into the system? Now, grazing animals can help with stimulating greater levels of photosynthetic rates much more quickly than some of the small injuries that could happen with pollinators and those types of things. But still, we could look at managing pollinator strips and predatory insect strips and all of those things around our agricultural, around our crop land if we're not going to be putting grazers onto that land. So looking at those types of things, protecting the soil with residue with some sort of armor, although the best armor out there is cover crops,
Hmm.
living plants. Having living plants be an armor protection. You can absorb a whole lot more energy from wind and water and solar radiation by something that's living than something that's dead.
It would make
If
a lot of
your only
farmers
choice,
mad. It would make a lot of farmers mad, but I was speaking with an agronomist last week, and they were saying that they're like, well, worst case scenario, weeds make a great cover crop. And I'm
yeah,
like, they do. Even if you have to mow them down before they go to seed or whatever, but they make a cover crop.
they make a cover crop. They make a and again, if your choice is between having a weed that you mow down or not having anything growing there, I'm going to be like, okay, these are your options. Think about what's happening to carbon cycling. If you
Mhm.
have a weed that's growing there, it's going to be putting some carbon below ground. Depending on the type of plant it is, there may be more or less exudates. And so maybe you could look at managing the types of weeds that you would have out there so that you would get more carbon below ground. You can mimic some of the stresses that happen with grazing by doing some mowing. So you
Hmm.
could still increase that photosynthetic rate on the part of the weeds in being able to manage it. And again, looking at that those stressors, I think of the animals as a part of the system, or those stressors as a part of the system, but they're a part of the system that we could use as tools to help us manage issues that we have. So when we have weeds that are part of the system, or if you have perennials that you want to go into an annual landscape, utilize the animals as a tool, both from their hoof traffic and disruption to the roots, the surface roots, and subsurface roots, the roots that are right at the that can be important to keeping those perennials growing by increasing the density of the animals to disrupt some of that root mat that's there, and grazing and overgrazing. I mean,
Hmm.
we don't think of the things that we often put in as these every living organism is growing for its living and growing for its own sake. Even the mycorrhizal fungi that I fell in love with when I was 19 years old and have yet to fall out of love with, um, I know that as much as they do benefits to living plants and to crop plants, and I think they could solve a lot of our issues with fertility and water, I also know that they're living for themselves. And so we have to recognize and utilize those tools to provide the benefits that it is that we're looking for,
Hmm.
um, and making sure that we do that. So again, the animals are a tool. I get in trouble with ranchers all the time because I'm just like, you're growing soil, that's your crop, and your plants and your animals are tools to do that. And you need to think about them as tools. And they're
Yeah,
like, no, no, that's where I make my money. And I'm like, I get that. But you can only make your money if the soil is healthy.
right.
So, how do we address the soil first and utilize your tools to address the soil?
Put everything into balance. We're running out of time here, but I
Yeah.
have one more question for you. If you could leave farmers with one thing to remember about what's beneath their boots, what would that be?
The one thing to remember is to treat the soil like you think you would want to be treated. Make sure you
Golden rule.
feed it. Yes, that's a golden rule. It's a golden rule for everything. You're supposed to treat your friends and neighbors and your enemies like you would want to be treated. You treat your soil like you want to be treated. Feed it, feed it. Don't let it starve. So feed it every day. Keep it protected. Make sure that it has the nutrients available when it needs those nutrients to be available. And, that you make sure that it you have to do some work, you have to do some exercise to be healthy. You want a diverse diet. You need a consistent food access. You need to make sure that you're protected from weather events, from solar radiation. You know, the practical farmers of Iowa have a saying that they use on some of their t-shirts, and it's basically to promote cover crops, but the idea is don't farm naked. And it's that's it. We don't want our soil to be naked and starving, and that if you treat your soil like you're supposed to treat yourself, like you want to be treated, you'll win. It'll
Right.
make dollars and cents.
I love it. And we didn't even have time to get into all the economics and stuff. That might have to be for another podcast. I feel like we could
Yes.
talk all day long, Kris.
I know. I have verbal vomit disease, but I think that
It's
it's important for
fascinating
us.
stuff. It's very complex systems, and I love it. I want to thank you so much for joining us. And that was Kris Nichols on Ruminating with Real Egg.